Yes, the mic's working, thank you. Morning everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion on meeting shared climate challenges through the British Irish Council. I'm William Wickman, one of the joint heads at the British Irish Council Secretariat, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the UK Pavilion team for hosting us here this morning. By way of background, the British Irish Council is one of the key institutions arising from the Northern Ireland peace process. It focuses on promoting practical and positive relationships between our 8 member administrations. And we're delighted this morning to be joined by ministers from 2 of those member administrations. We have Nicola Mallon, MLA, Minister for Infrastructure at the Northern Ireland Executive, and Michael Matheson, MSP, Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero, Energy and Transport from the Scottish Government. The 5 further British Irish Council administrations who aren't joining us today are the Welsh Government, the UK Government, the Isle of Man Government, the Government of Jersey and the Government of Guernsey. I'd also like to share Minister Ryan from the Irish Government's apologies for not being able to join us this morning as he was held up in negotiations, fairly understandably. And finally, I'd like to introduce my colleague and fellow joint head, Aoife Fleming, who will be facilitating questions from the audience today. So with that, I'll hand over to Minister Mallon to speak to the work of the British Irish Council on transport policy.
Morning, everybody, and thank you. Yes, I'm the Minister for Infrastructure in the North, and I chair the transport sector working group with all of the different administrations. We're actually quite newly formed, but we have agreed our work programme. And so our work programme basically breaks down into 3 pillars. One is around modal shift, so encouraging people to make less journeys, which I hope will be facilitated by hybrid working through COVID. Then promoting active travel, so ensuring that people have the opportunity and that the infrastructure is there to enable them to walk, wheel and cycle for those shorter journeys, because we know they're still jumping into their cars. And then also looking at issues around de-incentivising car use, and then looking at assisting people to make the switch across to electric vehicles if they still have to have access to their own private car. The second strand then is around decarbonisation of transport, so individual vehicles, but particularly around our public transport fleet. And there's a number of different pieces of work going on right across the different administrations on that. And it's about looking at alternative fuels as well. And then the third pillar is around the decarbonisation of freight. And it's kind of looking to see what each administration is doing, how we can support each other and support demonstration projects to bring forward alternative fuels for commercial operators. And I suppose what I have certainly learnt from my engagement is that it is really invaluable. Sometimes as a minister you go to meetings and they're just box-ticking exercises, but actually through the British Irish Council what I have found is that there really is genuine collaboration. There is very sincere information sharing and learning being shared, which I find very valuable, because all of us are on the same pathway in terms of decarbonisation and the climate emergency, but we're at different points and operating on different scales. And so I think it's really useful that we can work and learn from each other. Really important as well is the engagement that happens spilling out from that as well. And ministers, in my experience, have been very honest about the challenges that they have faced and really trying to support other ministerial colleagues to avoid making those mistakes, which is hugely important. So I have to say from my engagement, I've found it extremely valuable, and I really look forward to continuing to have that engagement and to have those meetings.
Thank you very much. I'll now hand over to Cabinet Secretary Matheson.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for your invitation to join you here this morning and to say a bit about the environment work stream and the importance that that plays to the ongoing dialogue through the British Irish Council. The first thing I want to say, though, is that as we try to tackle the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss, we need to recognise that they are both entirely interdependent on one another. So you can't look at trying to tackle climate change without also recognising the need to tackle biodiversity loss as well. And one of the key things that I think, as Nicola has made reference to, is for many countries, including right across the British Irish Council area, is that we all have our plans and our strategies to become net zero nations, whether it be by 2040, 2045 or 2050. And it can at times feel as though it's a fairly lonely road that you're trying to work your way through. And one of the key things that I've taken from COP, because this is my first COP since I've come into this ministerial portfolio, is the need for collaboration and cooperation. There are two key things that I've heard over the course of the last 2 weeks. And how do we build on that, and how do we make better use of that? And the British Irish Council, I think, is a very good example of how that cooperation and collaboration can play an important part across the nations of these islands. And on the environment in particular, there have been a number of very significant work streams that have been taken forward. Before I go into just mentioning some of the work that's been taken forward through the British Irish Council, I have got a confession to offer up here this morning. I have never been to a British Irish Council ministerial meeting. So I believe there may be one in February on energy, which I look forward to joining. I think it may be in Jersey, but that will be my first opportunity to engage through the British Irish Council. But I know from my portfolio the work that we have been taking forward. So, for example, on climate adaptation, dealing with the locked-in aspects of climate change that we are already facing, and how we can adapt and how we have to take forward mitigation measures in order to deal with these. And the climate adaptation subgroup has played a leading role in working with all of the parties within the British Irish Council on how we can develop our climate adaptation plans and how we can take forward appropriate measures to deal with climate adaptation, which help to inform our climate adaptation strategy, which we now use at a national level here in Scotland. The second area where we have been taking forward some joint work has been an issue of invasive species and the potential impact that they can have on our own biodiversity. So one of the things that's often forgotten about is not just the negative environmental impact of invasive species, but also the cost that they have on an annual basis. And it's estimated, I think, in the UK, the invasive species cost us something in the region of £2 billion. And they also have a negative impact on tackling climate change, which is why it's extremely important that across these islands we work together to try and tackle these things collectively. And one example of that has been the issue around the Hornet Working Group, which has been looking at how we can tackle what is an invasive species. I believe it got to the Channel Islands, and how we try to limit that and getting to other parts of the UK and Ireland. And again, that type of collaborative working plays a really important role in tackling invasive species. And the third area I want to touch upon is in our marine environment, that precious natural and marine environment, which actually links and is key to linking together all parts of the British and Irish Council countries. And a specific area we've been working on is on marine litter and the scourge of particularly plastic marine litter to our natural environment. And there's been a significant amount of work taken forward in that. That's included looking at fishing gear. We have now developed a programme of work around that off the back of the collaboration we've had through the British Irish Council, and also on dealing with the plastic pellets and how they end up in our water stream. And we now have a standard through the British standards, which we apply at a Scottish level, which is now an open portal that others can make use of to help small, medium and large-sized businesses to manage these things. So that's 3 areas alone in the environmental area where we have been collaborating and cooperating, sharing good practice and experience. And I want to make sure we build on that going forward, because it will play a crucial role in helping to support us in dealing with the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. And on that note, I will pause and we can have an open discussion.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary Matheson, and also thank you, Minister Mallon. And yes, indeed, we do want to have a good conversation here. And so I would like to open the floor for any questions, if anyone would like to put them to our panellists. Perfect.
Yeah, it's a huge issue. And if I put the party political hat on, like the SDLP, because obviously I'm its minister around the executive, Colin Eastwood has been raising this issue because we do have far too many of our young people leaving to go to university. And there's issues around, university places in the north and CAPS there. And then they go away and they just don't come back. And we are losing that intelligence, but also that enthusiasm and commitment. I mean, even yesterday when I was walking about, I met a young lad from my own constituency, North Belfast, who had won Young Planner of the Year. He's working in London. And he said to me, I really want to come back home. If there was employment there and there were the opportunities, I would rather be home in Belfast than be in London. And then again, there's today, we're meeting you. So we need to get better at providing many more opportunities at education and skills level, but also employment. But if you want me to be really straight with you, we also need to get rid of the toxic political environment in Northern Ireland that is turning so many of our young people away. So, at a number of levels, we need to get much better, but it is a huge issue, and it's something that personally I feel very sad about.
Thank you very much, Minister Mallon. And absolutely, I mean, with the loss of students like yourself, obviously that has an impact in terms of the input those students would provide in tackling these challenges. And I'll look, would anyone else would you like to
could
input
I just
on that?
say a wee bit more on that? Because one of the real concerns I have around the level of work that we'll need to take forward in order to tackle climate change is having access to labour and skills. I think that is one of the issues that is increasingly coming onto my radar as a point of concern. Now, I know from discussing with major players in the renewable energy sector in Scotland that they are, not at this point, but they are worried about access to labour and skilled labour. And I think there is an issue across the whole of the UK and Ireland that we need to understand is that, and I'll say Brexit is having an impact on this, and we need to understand that could then start to compromise our ability to move at the pace that we need to in order to tackle climate change. So I've heard over and over again here at this summit about the need for pace, and this is a decisive decade. And we heard it from the World Leaders Summit last week as well. So key to that is not just the deployment of technology, it's also having the skills base to both manufacture and install and to maintain that technology. And that requires access to labour and skilled labour. And we need to start to recognise that limited access to the right labour markets could compromise our ability to move at the pace at which we need to in tackling climate change. So it's slightly different from the situation in Northern Ireland, but it's something which I think could affect all of the British Irish Council area, and we need to be alive to it, and we need to move quickly if it starts to become a significant barrier.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary Matheson. Would anyone else like to? Please do.
Perfect, thank you. I'm Christiana Logan from SSE. First, I would agree with what the Minister said, that the brain drain and the challenge of recruitment is a challenge in the renewable energy sector. What's interesting to me is how we can work with local communities on this transition, whether it's on transport or on environment, because the impact that we have as renewable energy developers and building transmission infrastructure can come as a negative to those local communities. So we're working on how do we bring some positives to them so that we can get them involved in the transition in a more positive way. So interested in any examples from that.
Would you like to take this?
So I think you make a really, really good point. So if you look at our targets here in Scotland in renewable energy, both on and offshore, so in offshore, we want to get 11 gigawatts between now and 2030. A lot of that will probably be through both fixed and floating offshore wind developments. Onshore, we want to get up to between 8 and 12 gigawatts. The reality is that almost 30% of Scotland's land is protected, and about another 10% of that is highly protected, which means that as we roll out more of these programmes, we will find that the space in which the developments can take place becomes more and more confined. And then we'll also have our marine protected areas, which again limits the areas offshore that can be developed. And then you find yourself in conflict with not so much the local community directly, but it's more to do with the fishing community because it then limits their fishing waters. So there are a number of competing demands that we need to try and help to manage here. And I think one of the things that's absolutely key in tackling climate change is that putting the energy aspect aside is that it can't be a top-down approach. We need to make sure we take communities with us, and we need to make sure that they feel part of the process and the decision-making process as well, which is why we set up the Climate Assembly. Which set out 81 recommendations for government. We've got a limit of 6 months to respond to them. They're challenging, they're ambitious, and it's a way of trying to engage a wider sector within our community in being involved in that, with the Children's Parliament and everything involved in the process. But getting back to your specific point about energy, we need to make sure that operators, and I know SSE do this, but we need to make sure developers of onshore and to some degree offshore going forward are using the good practice guidance which we've issued, and to make sure that communities feel as though they're part of they get some of the benefits that come from these developments, and that they can see the material impact that will have on their community, given that it has a significant impact on their local environment. So we need to make sure that developers recognise that they are being leased a piece of land or a piece of seabed that doesn't belong to them, that they will probably only be there for 25 or 30 years, that the community will actually have to live with whatever they're putting in that particular site, and that they need to make sure that they see some benefit, just in terms of community benefit, but also economic benefit. And I had a really good example recently. I was down in Lockerbie opening a new onshore wind farm, and the community there actually have now taken a 5%, through the scheme, taken a 5% stake in the actual wind farm. And through that, the local community will get around £5 million, which will make a big difference to a rural community. But it's an example of getting it right. And we need to make sure other developers are doing the exact same thing.
Thank you very much. I think that's a really innovative example.
Yeah,
Minister Mallon?
I agree with everything there that Michael has said. I suppose what I would add is you need to make sure that you have a planning system that is fit for purpose. If you have ambitious renewable targets, you need to make sure that your planning system is appropriate. So I've initiated a review of strategic planning policy around renewable energy and low carbon, because I want to make sure that it's modern and fit for purpose. I suppose the other thing that I would add is that your question really epitomises for me the fundamental challenge here, and it's the challenge of change. So we're all talking about climate action, but when it comes to people's front doors, that's when the tension really hits. And what you really need at that stage is to make sure that we're listening to communities, that they can see the benefit, that we're having a wide informed discussion about it as well. I think that's really critical, that communities feel empowered through the process. And it requires political leadership, because we can sign up to ambitious targets, but if there's a wind farm, for example, in your constituency and your constituents are opposed, then again there's another level of tension that comes through. So I suppose this is the challenge of change that is facing us all. But I would reiterate the points that Michael made about when the communities or companies are coming in, they really need to be genuinely engaging with, and I know SSE does this, engaging with communities and making sure that they are part of the process and can see the benefits as well. I think that's hugely important.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to put a question to our panel? Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm just at a nice intersection of the whole council. So in addition to being a student, I'm also an entrepreneur. So I haven't graduated yet, but I'm developing a startup that uses subsea robotics to support large-scale restoration of seagrass meadows, so a fantastic carbon sink and bastions of biodiversity. And within Britain, there's been a lot of action recently about restoring seagrass meadows in Wales, England and Scotland, differing frameworks between the countries, but there's certainly a growing interest there. However, within Ireland, it's seemingly radio silence, and I was wondering what sort of restoration actions are taking place within the island of Ireland as a whole.
Yeah, so that the restoration issues would fall to Minister Poots, so they fall outside of my portfolio, so I wouldn't have the detail of that. But I do know that in the Assembly this week, Cara Hunter, who's a colleague of mine, and she may have been engaging with you when she was over a COP, but she was raising the issue of seagrass and the potential there, and I know that she did put that to Minister Poots in question time. So maybe if you want to go back and look, and Hansard, you'd be able to see what the Minister set out in terms of what we're doing or not doing, or what his intentions might be.
Thank you very much, Minister Mallon. I don't know if Cabinet Secretary Matheson, if you want to speak on the Scottish example.
Yeah, I think so, but I think one of the things that we need to make sure that we do, and you mentioned that you're an entrepreneur and you're looking to develop use of robotics and in managing and protecting seagrass, is that we need to make sure that we are capturing the new technology and the new ideas that can help us in tackling climate change. And we need to make sure that we are providing a space for entrepreneurs like yourself to be able to develop that technology and also to then potentially commercialise it. So you're at Edinburgh. Try to think of off the top of my head an Edinburgh sort of idea, but I know over the years they have had a lot of spin-outs. If I go for another Edinburgh University, Heriot Watt University, a company called Sunamp, which was a spin-out from Heriot Watt University, which is now a very successful business, operating I think in 30 or 40 countries across the world, ramping up. Again, it's a battery technology which can be used alongside things like air source heat pumps, etc., and it can be used in different environments, which is very small and compact, and they're very competitive in looking at how they can push that on even further. But it's a very good example of a technology that came from students at an academic level that's now a spin-out and is now commercially doing extremely well globally and is playing an important part in tackling climate change. And the work that you're doing potentially can play that role as well. So I think we need to make sure that as we go along this journey to net zero, is that we are creating a space and the opportunity for folk like yourself to be able to commercialise these developments if they're proven to be able to do what they're intending to do, and they can add value to what we're trying to achieve. And that's an important bit for government to get right for you as well.
I mean, just on that, I mean, it's in looking at climate action and what's required, huge amount of investment, and the public sector is not going to be able to bring that to the table. So on this particular issue, the need for the synergies and partnership working right across the private sector with government at the central and local level, but also in communities as well, for me is absolutely critical. So, you know, I did concur with what Michael's saying. We need to be making sure that the space is there and that we're able to support entrepreneurs who are going to be pushing the boundaries in terms of innovation and technology to give us the new solutions that we need. And because that's the only way we're going to get to grips with this, it has to be around new emerging technologies, innovation, and so we have to be supporting our entrepreneurs by necessity to do that.
And I think just building on that as well, because I agree with Nicola, we all know that some of the technology that we'll need to get to net zero has not been developed yet. So, and there is significant private sector investment out there keen to invest in what they see as new climate change technology. So the money's there, the opportunities are there, we just need to make sure that we are creating the right space to allow you to develop that. But the pathway to net zero, you know, is when it's set out, but some of the technology is still going to have to be created and developed for us to make sure we can get there in the timeframes that we've set.
I would just like to reply, if that's all right. Well, I would say in Northern Ireland, there's definitely a fantastic ecosystem for startups. So yes. I started my journey at Catalyst Inc. when I was 17 and beside the Titanic Order, and they were fantastic at sort of steering me to where I am today. And I would also say that Scotland is hugely supportive of startups, particularly within Edinburgh. There's a fantastic ecosystem for encouraging entrepreneurship and innovation. And to the Scottish Government as well, I actually have a meeting with Mary McCallan, who's the Secretary for the Environment, at the end of this month. So there's a lot being done on all fronts.
Thank you. And I think there's a real theme of innovation, education, opportunities that's emerging here, which I think is really interesting. Would anyone else like to step in on that theme, or indeed much more broadly?
If I maybe could just say one of the other things as well, because it is about, you know, innovation and collaboration, but I really think that we haven't cracked yet the kind of language and the public narrative. And what I'm very conscious of, because I have responsibility for public transport and active travel, even if I look at trying to put in a cycle lane, it's all phrased wrong. It's about people feeling that they're losing road space, that if I'm choosing to invest in public transport, then I'm denying somebody somewhere else. And that is true, you're making political choices. But I think we all need to get better here. Instead of talking about what we're losing, what we're actually gaining. And I think we all need to get a bit better at that. And talking to communities and it's not presenting it like that. It's actually, those are the facts. The climate action brings environmental benefits, but it also is a public health issue, and it's also a social justice issue. So there is much more to be gained at multiple levels for citizens individually and collectively, but we just need to have more confidence in having that conversation and pushing that narrative and putting those facts out there for people.
Thank you very much. And
Can I say, I think this is a really important point here, the language, Nicola, because very often when you have discussions around climate change, it's the challenge of climate change. I do it myself, rather than the opportunity that we have to both save our planet and to actually redesign our local communities. That's what I see things like active travel as being, actually to be able to redesign our local communities in a much better way than they are just now. So I think we have to be very conscious of that language. And actually, the noises that come from COPs don't help because it's a negotiation. It's what's in the text, what's out the text, which in itself sends out this signal that it's actually, this is a difficult thing and it's maybe not a good thing, etc. So we do need to change that whole narrative around and recognising, yes, it's got challenges, yes, it will be difficult. It is, if anybody, we all had the answers to this, we would have this problem solved. But we don't. But there are also massive opportunities here, and it's trying to get people's mindset into that as well. And I think there's a responsibility in us as in leadership roles in politics to use the right language to try and help to get people engaged in what is a positive thing as opposed to being a negative thing as well, which I think is going to be one of the big challenges over the next couple of years as we start to get to what I would say the things that we really have to do that are politically much more challenging. But the other part to that is that politically we need to be mature in our debate and in our discourse around it. If we allow it to sink down to, we're not going to, you're stopping cars from coming into town, that's terrible, and we want the cars to be allowed to come in, we won't get anywhere. So we need to have a maturity in our debate at a political level to allow us to make sure we make the right changes in order to make progress.
yes, and and looking at those issues, it's much broader than infrastructure. It's behavioural, it's psychological, it's so many disciplines almost, you could say.
It is. And it's the hardest thing in the world to change behaviour. It's hard to change your own behaviour, and then you're trying to change your entire population, a global population. So it is very challenging, and that's why I think that point around having the right language and talking about the opportunities. And also, absolutely agree with Michael. We have to be honest with people. This is going to be hugely difficult, but even when it being difficult, there are massive, massive opportunities to just transform people in terms of health and well-being, the environment, biodiversity, the economy, our society. So I think that's just a really important piece. It's kind of missing at the moment.
And the bit that's difficult for politicians is that when you start taking forward policies that impact on people's behaviour, the political risks shoot up. So my view, the progress that's been made over the course of, let's just say the last 10 years, in some places it's been good progress, but in some instances it's been the low-hanging fruit. So now this decade is going to be about making some really difficult decisions, and that will require political courage and political commitment and leadership in order to do that, which is why the debate has to be one which is a respectful one, but also acknowledging that we have to have maturity in our discourse around climate change. And that will, because otherwise the targets will not be reached because it will be inhibited by a lack of political will to do what are the difficult things. But politicians, I know myself, we tend to shy away from doing things that we know will impact in people's lives because we know that we've got an election in 5 years' time. They'll say, you did that and I don't like it, or it's costing me money, despite the fact that we know we have to do it to meet our climate change targets. So that's going to be, I think that's going to be one of the big challenges right across the British Irish Council area, is the level of political honesty and maturity of the debate, which will play a big part in how much pace we can inject into the changes that we need to make in the next 10 years.
Thank you very much. Food for thought indeed. Would anyone else like to jump in with a question? Okay, we have two. So I think we'll, yes, I think if you pass it over there first. You have already had a question, and then you can have a second one. Perfect, thank you.
Can I take the mask? Is that okay?
Yes.
Good morning. I am a reader in Sustainable Urban Design at University of Dundee. I think what is important when it's come to active travel, it's as well to put our places in the context of 2040 and 2050 and think beyond the political cycle, which is 5 years. It's not just enough to give people 2 cycle lanes and to tell them, look, you go and cycle. People will not change behavior by telling them to. People will change when the context combine them to. The journey for Copenhagen started in 1970, 1980. After 50 years now, they get 65 people on bike. And why is that, by the way? It has nothing to do with climate change. It has absolutely nothing to do with environmental awareness. It is to do with their pocket. It's to do with what is convenient to them. Because now from A to B in Copenhagen, you could cross that in 15 to 20 minutes. Safety, secure, that's what we need to think about. Trust me, it has nothing to do with environmental issues. So it's about putting our places, our country, for the next 20, 30 years beyond the political cycle. Thank you.
Can I just respond? I absolutely agree with you on that. So, like, for me, for public transport, for example, I'm encouraging people to get out of their private cars and come onto the buses. I need to make sure they are as accessible and as affordable, and that they run on time and they're reliable and all of the things, because those are the things that really make people change their behaviour. And once they change, make them continue to adapt and with that behaviour. So it's hugely important. And I also agree with you about the need to have a vision longer than the election cycles. And there's the reality of election cycles. But in Northern Ireland, I've been pushing for the establishment of an independent infrastructure commission, so that it would look at and have a vision of infrastructure that's inclusive and sustainable of 30 years up to 2050. And there would be experts. And so it would lift infrastructure, for example, out of the kind of political bear pit in many ways and the election cycle, and would enable us to have a much more strategic approach and to come at it from all of the different levels for me that make up infrastructure. So in my ideal world, it would look at housing, it would look at the environment, it would look at the physical infrastructure as well. And because I think if you don't have that, it's very, very difficult, because you get trapped as a politician in election cycles. You know, an election for me, for example, is in May, but all of the parties are already in election mode. There's no cooperation, there's no incentive for cooperation. It's about finding faults. And it's very difficult then to make strategic progress. So, I agree, and I'll continue to push. And we seem to be making some headway around the Infrastructure Commission in Northern Ireland, and I really hope we do, because I think it would be a game changer.
I think I completely agree with you. So one of the things when I was dealing with transport in my previous portfolio that I took forward in active travel was to shift our approach away from doing lots of small projects to doing fewer big projects. So that would make a change, and it would be very obvious in making a change. I don't know if there's anybody in here from Glasgow, but there's a new piece of cycle infrastructure that goes, it's in the south side of Glasgow, that goes from Queen's Park into the Merchant City, the South City Way, both sides of the road. It has completely transformed Victoria Road, which is now full of cafes and everything. It's just the whole environment has been completely transformed in a really positive way. Businesses see the benefit of it, despite the fact that they were hostile to the idea of losing road space for cars to park. But you now see from the numbers of people who are now using that as a principal route to cycle straight into the heart of Glasgow, the difference that it's actually making. So my view is that we need to make putting active travel infrastructure in place not an add-on, but actually a core to what we do. Actually, why wouldn't you have active travel infrastructure there? There's something not right in that area because it doesn't have active travel infrastructure. Completely flip the whole focus on active travel infrastructure, which is why between now, this year, and the end of this parliamentary session, our funding for active travel will go from £115 million a year to £320 million, which is 10% of our transport budget will go on active travel investment alone. So, and it is very clear to me, is that now if you go to places like South City Way, if you go to Sucky Hall Street, not far from here, is that it's not just the traditional cyclists that are using it, it's new people who are using it because the infrastructure there, it's easy, it's safe, and it's also, it makes the choice of using active infrastructure much, much more attractive. And that will help to create change.
The last thing, just on this point, if I may say, just on this point, if you allow me to say it, I know politics is big game in Scotland. We do need more prototype in Scotland to aspire to. We need one or two strong examples. What is a livable neighborhood? What is a walkable neighborhood? What is a good town center for living? And the only things, if we start investing in one or two prototypes, so we Scottish, we aspire to. And thank you very much for your time.
Can I just say, this brings us back to the point earlier on, and it's about the language that we use. So I actually cycled the route yesterday that Michael was talking about, and it was transformative. It was really, really wonderful. But again, it brings a point about, because I'm encountering this at home, that businesses believe that all of their customers, or the vast majority of them, travel by car. And the evidence, because Queen's University Belfast has done a piece of research, and it clearly shows that the majority of customers walk. But it's about, again, that thing that we're going to lose by putting in cycle infrastructure. I'm going to lose business. My customers won't be able to come. As a car driver, I'm going to lose. And it's again about saying, well, actually, that has acted as a catalyst for regeneration. The new businesses, the cafes that are flourishing, greater footfall. So it's about, again, seeing active travel in that as the core and fundamental to change, because it's not just about giving people the infrastructure and making it accessible and safe and secure, but it's also the spin-off benefits. A safer area, crime comes down. I mean, this is all well evidenced, and then the businesses around it grow. So again, it comes back to our language, doesn't it, about how we are talking about these things, and importantly, the evidence that's there to back it up, because that's important as well as prototypes. I do believe seeing is believing. But in this society that we live in, facts are becoming irrelevant, which is hugely dangerous as well. So we need to make sure that we're confidently putting the evidence and the information about there about what all of this does actually deliver.
Thank you very much. And I think we have another question lined up there. So if you could pass it over, perfect.
Yeah, you've spoken really clearly about the importance of the language and how it can sometimes be a bit negative and around challenges. We hear a lot about trade-offs, which again has a similarly negative connotation, that we'll have to lose out on something in order to do something else. How do you think we could change that narrative, given what's been discussed at COP about the twin challenges, and that by tackling climate change, we'll tackle biodiversity, we'll tackle things on the transport and health side as well?
So I think in politics, what we would often say is that we're reprioritizing. So something which is usually a euphemism for taking money from one budget and putting it into another budget. So
giving away all the secrets,
exactly,
Michael.
that's one of the inside tricks. So look, I think you're right, because all the issues around putting in renewable energy, putting in active travel infrastructure, all the things that we do to tackle both climate change and biodiversity are all just elements of the way in which we need to fundamentally change our society. So we are tackling climate change is not a technical process. So I hear some of my colleagues, some other ministerial colleagues saying, it's quite technical, your portfolio around all these things that we're doing around climate change. Actually, what we're trying to do is create societal change. That will take time, and it's really, really challenging. And let me give you a practical example of how businesses will have to adapt. So my father-in-law, he's a heating engineer. He's a manager in a company. He will tell me that if you want to put a gas boiler or a gas central heating system into someone's house, he can send in 4 gas fitters and they'll have it in that house in a day. But if we want him to go and put in an air source heat pump, he will have to send in 4 engineers and he'll probably be in the same house for 3 or 4 days. But his whole business model is predicated on the basis of sending 4 engineers in and doing it in 1 day and then moving on to the next house. So we're actually looking at societal change here, which is about businesses having to change their business model and adapt to that, and the transition that will be necessary around that, and also reprioritizing things in our society in a way that were previously lower priorities. And a very good example of that transition is that, you know, in my time in politics, I have never witnessed an area of policy become so central to political thinking and the political debate than I have around climate change, particularly over the course of the last 18 months to 2 years. It is now the dominating factor in so much around health. If we didn't have the pandemic, it would all be about climate change and biodiversity loss. So we can see that shift happening. And it means that we are going to have to decide on the things that we thought previously were a priority are no longer a priority. That hierarchy is going to change. And I suspect Nicola will go through the same thing that we had during our Scottish Parliament elections in May, is that we'll have the political parties all coming out with the various roads that they want to see investment in. And at the same time, investment in active travel infrastructure, investment in all these other climate change projects. But actually you're thinking, well, where is the priorities here? So that issue around it's about reframing our society, changing some of the fundamental things that we've been doing for, you know, generations, which is going to be quite challenging, and it's going to require quite a bit of change, and it's going to carry a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of risks with it as well.
And, you know, building on that, like prior to the pandemic, we couldn't have envisaged that and the way that we would fundamentally change. Governments prioritised the health of their citizens and fundamentally took decisions that radically changed the way we live and work. So we did that for COVID. We know, like in government, that you can adapt and you can change, you can reprioritise spend. And so we absolutely need to do the same thing with the climate emergency. We need to show the same urgency, the same agility, and the same fervour in terms of prioritising it and driving that change. So for me, through the horrors of COVID, this is actually one of the opportunities and lights that I see coming from it, that change, mass change quite quickly is actually possible if everybody puts their minds to it.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for just one last question. Would anyone like to put it to our panellists?
You have two ministers that you can grill and ask anything to, and you aren't.
Well, as I say when I go to schools when they don't have any questions, if you don't ask me questions, we'll start asking you questions.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
I think we have one here. Yeah, perfect. Thanks.
Hi, yeah, just to bring it back to the active travel a little bit, but probably wider implications as well. You talked about how, for example, with the South City Way, which I actually have cycled and it is great, so I can also recommend that. The businesses feared that it was going to harm their businesses and things, and I think that it's probably quite a local politicsy sort of question, but there's a sort of debate going on within sort of London where they've had a lot of these schemes about whether you should consult first to bring people with you or put the scheme in and then have consultation ongoing, and there's sort of the accusations of we didn't get a consultation, we need to rip it out straight away. Or if you have a consultation, the people who reply to it aren't necessarily the ones who would be a representative sample. So I just wanted to, whether you've got any thoughts on the best way of actually bringing people with you on that.
Yeah, this is very difficult. So what we did in Northern Ireland and what I pushed during COVID was it was an emergency situation. So we prioritised making sure that there was safe cycling infrastructure to and from our hospitals for our healthcare workers. And so we went and we put in pilots straight away, and we're now reviewing those. And I have had criticism that we didn't do a level of consultation, and normally we would. And I think it's really important that you consult and engage with local communities. But we also have to be mindful that if it becomes a method for paralysis to change, then that's not good either. And so certainly from my perspective as a minister, it is something that I struggle with, because you could have a scheme and there's a very small number of people who object. And so the question then becomes, do you hold up progress? Because you're never going to get a situation where you can take absolutely everybody with you. I suppose reflecting on my own experience as well, and it's coming back to the point around seeing is believing. People fear change and they don't want it, but then when it is in place, they actually recognise that this is something that's really good and they embrace it. So I don't know exactly what the answer to your question is. You must consult. I think it's really important. And it's Michael's point about you can't deliver sustainable change from the top down. You need to work with communities to identify what's going to work, where it's going to work. But I'm also very conscious that you could have death by consultation, and then in the end, you never really get anything done.
So coming in here this morning, if you were coming in through the gates on the from the Glasgow City centre side, you would have noticed over on the far side the porpoises which are still on the road, which provide the cycle lane infrastructure. They were put in a temporary basis as part of a Spaces for People scheme, which was to help to support people during the lockdown to be able to get out and cycle. Cycling figures went through the roof during lockdown because there were so few cars on the roads and because of the temporary infrastructure we've put in place. You can go all the way from here, all the way right along to Glasgow Green in cycle lanes that are temporary cycle lanes that have been put in place. So I think and there was no consultation. So I think one of the challenges here is that sometimes the consultation process can choke off the change that we're trying to achieve because people just think it's going to be negative and we don't know. So one of the things that I asked officials to, and they're working on this just now, is that let's try and work in the principle of let's test it out. Let's do a test drive of what we are looking to do so people can actually see what it will be like and can see what the impact will be through temporary infrastructure. So you wouldn't buy a car without having a test drive in it. So let's say to folk, let's put this in on a temporary basis, temporary infrastructure, which can be there for a period of time, and let's see how it works. And then what we can do is we can have the detailed formal consultation to go through the TRO process, which needs to be reformed because it takes too long and it's far too complex. And that's something which actually, right across the whole of the UK, we could actually do with achieving. Because I think if you get that tested out, you can address some of the concerns that people have got about change. And I think there are real lessons that we can learn from during the course of lockdown and how things like Spaces for People managed just to pop up with infrastructure, making a real difference very, very quickly. And now folk actually say, well, if we were to make it permanent, how do you feel about it? Actually, fine. It hasn't had the impact I thought. So I think we need to do more testing, closing off streets as well with temporary infrastructure to prevent cars from getting in as well for periods. Let's see how it works. Let's test it out. And if you like it, then we can then go through the formal process of actually making it formal.
Thank you. So I would like to say thank you to the audience for such wide-ranging questions. I think we've had a really interesting discussion here. And I would, of course, I'll just like to invite our panellists if they have any final words they want to say.
No, just to thank people for coming along and listening. And, you know, I think thinking on COP, and I mean, I'm heading home today, the overwhelming message here is that talking is done. Like, people are sick and tired of the talking. So it absolutely is time for action. And, you know, it's a huge challenge, but as we have discussed, there's many more opportunities in it. So it's really just sleeves, get them rolled up and get on with it.
So now, again, thank you very much for attending and for hosting the event. Two key things that have come through for me during the course of COP is collaboration and cooperation. Absolutely mission critical to being able to make progress at the pace we all know progress needs to be made at. And the British-Irish Council can play an important role across these islands in helping to support and achieve that, because we are all in the same collective journey to try and get to net zero. And that collaboration and cooperation can be really, really important in helping to support us on that process. So thank you for the work you're doing across the Council, and I look forward to engaging with colleagues across these islands in the months and years ahead to take forward our shared agenda in tackling climate change and biodiversity loss.
Thank you both, to you both, Minister Mallon and Cabinet Secretary Matheson, for those really, really interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Welcoming you to the Energy Ministerial, which is in Jersey, and it is in February.
Is that right?